Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again after quite a bit of a delay, and I apologize about that, to talk about the FaeGang, alright? I wanted to put together this guide for operating Fae Guardians, how it works, how you can maximize it, how it performs as well, for all of you guys out there, as we're very, very far into Castle Nathrian Season 1. We're kind of in the doldrums, and now might be a good time to give other Covenants a try if you haven't already, or if you're like me and some of your priorities for what your focus is in the game. So for me, I of course rated 10 and 10 Mythic with my guild, Lazarus Imperative. We cleared and I played Venthyr the entire time because Venthyr is ridiculous for disc while you're raiding. When it came to M+, I started by pushing a lot of M+ as disc, and when I was not running with the Boomkin, I just was crazy silly all the time, which made me pivot to play more Holy Priest in keys, which I've been doing a lot lately. Since then, I started thinking about how I can best adjust and improve my performance to help the team out, and Night Fae is really that great option for me, even though it does have a heavy penalty of being terrible for disc in a raiding environment. So if your priorities have shifted like mine have towards more of a Mythic Plus environment, then swapping to Night Fae might be the play for you. But if you're still progressing, you're still raiding, and you have a pretty good chance you're going to play disc in the raid, even though you might be, for example, a Holy main, but they might ask you to play disc on a couple fights or something, you should probably stay Venthyr if you're there already. Something to consider, but let's start getting into the reasons for why I swapped to begin with, okay? So, when I was playing a lot of disc in dungeons, like I mentioned, mana started becoming more and more of a problem at higher keys because I didn't have an Innervate, and I was basically the only disc priest who was pushing high keys without a Boomkin. So, wasn't really working out great for me. Didn't have the off healing, didn't have the treants, didn't have the Innervate. So, it was causing a lot of problems, so I made the pivot to Holy Priest. And even when I was playing Holy Priest, you're not really getting a lot of benefit out of the Venthyr ability. And with the buffs, especially for 905, Fae Guardians has definitely shown up as the best option for Holy Priest at M+, and a competitive option as well for Disc and M+, as well. But obviously, Carrion's still super strong for Disc if you're purely doing M+. So, let's talk about Fae Guardians, what it does, and why it's good, okay? It's a 1.5 minute cooldown, that means 90 seconds. Then it calls forth 3 fairies always. You're always going to get all 3 of these fairies, provided you maintain the requirements, okay? So your Wrathful Fairy will instantly jump out, okay? If you're targeting an enemy, it'll go jump out to that. If you target yourself, it'll go to a nearby enemy or anything like that. It automatically jumps to an enemy every single time that you cast Wrathful, or Fae Guardians in general, okay? Any direct attacks against that target restore mana to you. So what is a direct attack? Well, keep in mind the word any. That means not just you. Anybody, anything will count as a direct attack. I was playing around with a hunter outside the raid, and he popped a Demo Warlock Imp, and it was just casting onto the turnip that we were casting, still giving me mana. So anything in a raid environment or M+ environment that's getting attacked, that will be giving you mana, even if you are not attacking it. Okay? Key points to keep in mind. Your Guardian Fairy will reduce damage taken by 20%. Now keep in mind, all these fairies last 20 seconds, so this is probably the big one, the big nugget, that really helps out a lot in dungeons. 20% damage reduction for 20 seconds for your tank every 90 seconds. It's crazy. So even if you're not in an organized pug, which is what we always talked about for our third fairy, the Benevolent Fairy, which increases cooldown recovery rate of your target's major ability by 100%, even if you're not in a coordinated group where somebody's using their abilities on cooldown all the time and it's great and lovely and stuff, right? The Guardian Fairy definitely makes up for that in a big way. But, again, if you have a mage in your group who is combusting on CD, if you have somebody else who is constantly using their cooldowns, maybe a paladin or something like that, who always wants to be popping wings, then yeah, you're going to be able to get a lot of good value. If you're interested in an entire list of them, I'll make sure I put a link in the description below that kind of lists out what most everybody's CD is going to be. It follows what Vision of Perfection's Essence did last expansion, so I'll just include that link. Biggest thing though is that it gives you a lot of mana returned, 2, damage reduction onto your tank, which means you don't have to spam them as much, and 3, more damage for your allies by having their cooldowns being reduced. Of course, for Holy, you get more Divine Hymn, and Disc, you get more Rapture, which have some very, very niche values to get back in a dungeon, right? We'll talk about raids in a bit, of course, but very niche values that you have in a dungeon. Overall, though, Fae was the ideal pick for me if I wanted to continue playing Holy, and have the option to flex into playing more Disc and M+. Because like I told you, not having the Boomkin, didn't have the Treants, didn't have Innervate. So these Wrathful Fairies and the Guardian Fairy will really help kind of shore up that weak spot that I have and make my life a lot easier. Like I mentioned before, Kyrian, Disc Priest, and M+ is still very good. You still have a very high amount of Toma transfers, so kind of up to you onto that one. But since I've been flexing between Holy and Disc, where Holy Kyrian is pretty rough, it's pretty bad, Fae was the ideal one for me. So how do you really start operating this? There also, important to note, is the Covenant conduit called Fey Fermata. And so if you ever moved around any of your fairies, it would leave behind a small copy for about 5-6 seconds. It scales with the level of the of course, of the conduit, which you can get from Sire Denathries, which is nice because you can get a pretty easy 210, 213 conduit, or 226 if you're doing Mythic as well, to have an extra long 6-second duration to that buff, right? So with that 80% use that you get out of said fairy, you are also able to get multiple versions of that baby fairy. So that means, as a Disc Priest, if you ran Fey Fermata, as you're multi-dotting, as you're putting out a lot of Purge the Wickeds, you're putting out a ton of these miniature fairies, these 80% fairies, and so if everybody's attacking those enemies, you're actually gaining quite a bit of additional mana. It's a little bit, but it does add up over time. Another thing, one of the issues with using Fae Guardians as a Disc Priest in M+, is the fact that, hey, yeah, I put out my Guardian Fairy onto the tank, but what happens if I have to Shadow Mend spam the tank to make sure I keep the buff? Well, of course, when you're running with Fey Fermata, you're able to bounce and maintain that cooldown reduction onto the mage while still being able to spam heal the tank for a period of time. So you'll be able to say, all right, I'm Shadow Mending the tank a bunch, and I have 6 seconds of Shadow Mends before I gotta jump back and Shadow Mend the mage again to be able to bounce that buff. It sounds like a lot, but with high haste that you're also getting from like the Dreamweaver Soulbind, it's not as big of a problem. And if you're also including the fact that your tank's going to be having 20% DR for that entire duration, you often don't have to just be pounding heals into the tanks. So you will still get more value out of it that way. All in all, I do like the kit, and I'm starting to get more and more familiar with it from a Disc perspective. From a Holy perspective, I think it's a lot easier to pull off, as you primarily are using Flash Concentration and heavy casts of heal to be able to do the primary brunt of your healing, so you aren't jumping any sort of fairies around if you don't want to. I tried running with Fey Fermata as a Holy Priest, and I really didn't like it as much. I found that if you wanted to, for example, shield the entirety of your group while Fae Guardians is up to spread around all of that mini damage reduction, it was just very global heavy, and it didn't produce a lot of healing on its own, compared to if you, for example, had Fae Guardians up along with using Rapture, and then you have giant shields that take forever to get absorbed, and then you're sitting pretty and having a great time. So, similarly, spreading around like cooldown reduction and flash healing everybody or shadow mending everybody is a bit GCD intensive, so I never really bothered with that. The primary uses of Fey Fermata I found was really just a multi-dot to improve your mana regen, and it was decent. And I think that it's something more geared towards Discipline, because Discipline's a little bit less mana efficient in keys compared to Holy Priest. But, like I said, you can still kind of play around with it if you like. Fae Fermata is my preference for my second conduit alongside Shining Radiance for Disc, whereas for Holy, I didn't really end up using it, didn't really end up liking it. Now, this has all been covering how you use Fae Guardians and the conduit as well when it comes to an M+ environment. I don't think that you're really going to be using Fae Fermata at all in a raiding environment, and when I've been playing Night Fae in raids, a lot of my focus has been on playing Holy. I tried a couple of experimental builds with Spirit Shell and with Evangelism with Night Fae as Disc, and they were not great, let me tell you. But on the flip side, I was having some tremendous results with running Night Fae Holy Priest in a raid. Even when we were on fights like, Sire, for example, which is usually just kind of chock full of AoE that's going on. You have the benefit of getting cooldown reduction for your Divine Hymn. You've got the benefit of having just a lot of extra mana at your disposal. So that way you're going to be able to run something like Trail of Light. So you can be more aggressive there, try to pump out higher throughput and not have to really hold back at all. Because if you're running with Flash Concentration, it's pretty easy to be able to burn your mana. I know it's kind of a weird misnomer where I talk about how in an M+ environment, Holy's really mana efficient, but in a raid environment, you run Flash Concentration, you kind of got to pace yourself. That's kind of like a product of just very different types of content that you have going on. And of course, the difference between spamming heal onto everybody all the time and spamming some heals onto the tank in a dungeon and being able to top them and then move on to other things and move on to adding and contributing damage over time, right? It's kind of the different points of focus that you have to go on for. So when I've been running with Fae Guardians, there have been a number of fights. I think like Sludge Fist and Sire are pretty good examples where I'm like very close to being able to net out an additional Divine Hymn before the fight ends. Keep in mind, every cast of Fae Guardians, of course, is 100% additional cooldown recovery rate for that 20-second period. So what does that mean? It means that every second of time that passes knocks off 2 seconds of your cooldown. So in reality, every use of Fae Guardians knocks off 20 seconds every single time. So you usually aren't going to be getting tons and tons of extra casts out, but what it does really net you is better timing and better opportunity for a lot of your casts. You might have something, for example, like Council of Blood, like Sire, where you're going to be very close to getting a Divine Hymn back ordinarily, but a couple of uses later and you're saying, oh, I'm very confidently able to cast Divine Hymn on the third wave of Dancing Fever for Council of Blood. I'm very confidently going to be able to get off that Divine Hymn cast as all 4 of the ads are popping out and pulsing damage onto the entire party. You have a lot of flexibility in that regard, and we haven't even really been talking about how you want to use it on other DPS, because I can assure you, if you just ask in your raid, hey, who's going to benefit from 20% extra CD reduction on their abilities, on their primary ability every minute and a half, you're going to find people. In my experience, the people who've been banging down my door the most have been Unholy DKs. They've been Destro Warlocks, which I don't know how much of a thing that really is lately. Mages usually didn't want it in a raiding environment, but they generally do want it in Mythic Plus. And I'm sure Paladins were another one that, again, wouldn't mind at all. And those are probably the top ones that I have on my list. Some of the ones who never wanted Fae Guardians were Hunters and Affliction Warlocks. Those are the ones who told me absolutely don't. And Boomkins, I think, would need like multiple Faes to make it worth their while. So those are a couple of the more popular ones. But like I said, when in doubt, you can always cast it onto yourself. And while you may not get extra casts, there's certainly quite a bit of value in getting more optimal timing for your casts to make your life quite a bit easier. On top of that, like I said, mana regen is great. The damage reduction is also very, very flexible. So when we talked about moving fairies before, you have that option to cast Fae Guardians, toss it on yourself for a mechanic. Once that mechanic's over, you toss it onto a tank. You have that flexibility with a cast where you can start jumping that really at your leisure. You can put it onto one tank as they're tanking the boss. You can flip it to the next tank as well. That shores up a really big weak spot from a Holy perspective where you don't really have great tank defensives at your disposal in a raid. But now you're bringing, you could say, a miniature form of of pain suppression, but one that lasts a lot longer and gets you really high uptime. Now, a lot of tank busters, of course, are going to be over the duration of like a couple seconds. You know, it's just maybe one really big hit and then the other tank taunts or something. But that's the whole idea, is that you can flip it, you can move it, you can adjust it as you want. You can use it as a defensive, you can use it as a tank external. There's a lot of flexibility at your disposal. And I think from like a progression mindset, this is actually something that gives some crazy utility to the Holy Priest, especially for the incoming tier. I mean, just imagine being able to be more tanky yourself, be able to better support your tank better, and not really need to worry about any sort of mana when you're playing this, I'd say more mana intensive Flash Concentration build, where you can just be even more aggressive. You know, Holy already does a good job of being able to turn excess mana into additional throughput, and now you can continue with that. So, Fae Guardians, generally speaking, is just a very flexible and useful tool, and while it looks very confusing and kind of weird and strange, it's really not that bad at all. A couple of pro tips, things to keep in mind, of course, is whenever you cast Fae Guardians, you don't need to worry too terribly much about where your Wrathful Fairy goes, but it's always important to watch. The area where you're going to lose your Wrathful Fairy is if it jumps to an ad that's going to die soon. And that's where you have to move the fairy, and that's where you have to make sure it goes somewhere properly. On a fight like Sire, as long as it's going on Sire or Remornia or something like, or for example, if it goes on Sire, then great, everybody's going to be hitting him all the time. But if it goes on Remornia, she'll run away with her Massacre, and then nobody's hitting her. So that'll be a problem. If it goes on to one of the Crimson Kabbalists, well, those guys will eventually die, so that's a problem. Start watching as that works. I've also got a macro which works, I'd say, like 70% of the time. If you guys have one that works 100% of the time, I'd love to see it. But throughout my research, I found one that mostly works, but sometimes it's stubborn and doesn't like to. So often when I just kind of spam it a little extra, it'll work properly. But let me tell you, it's just a little bit weird. Otherwise, like I said, watch where that Wrathful Fairy goes. The way I usually do it is I cast Fae Guardians onto whoever I want the cooldown reduction to go on, whether that's me or whether that's somebody else, and then I cast a shield onto whoever I want to have the damage reduction. Since the shield cast goes off at the beginning of the global cooldown, unlike Flash Shield, which goes off at the end of the global cooldown, you're able to more rapidly preserve that sort of uptime that you want to be having for your ability. So, give it a shot. Especially a lot of my holy bros out there who are raiding and doing lots of Mythic Plus. If any of my disc bros are taking a break from raiding, taking a breather from it, or just kind of want to try something a little bit different, give Fae Guardians a try. Give it a shot before the new tier comes out, because pretty soon we're going to be having our 9-1 PTR. We're going to have all kinds of raid testing. We're going to have the new seasonal affix testing going on, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for being patient with me, of course, with all the breaks and stuff like that. I know it's been a while since I made any videos, but thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you all found it helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the description below, and sub to the channel for more cool content stuffs. All right, take it easy, guys. Love your faces. I'll catch y'all next time.